It started with something simple. A patch of earth, really. Nothing more than a forgotten strip of soil along the side of the house that most neighbors ignored. For years, the ground there had been barren and cracked, just a sun-scorched line, where grass refused to grow, but for me it became the canvas for something beautiful. A garden that wasn't just flowers or shrubs. It was my pride, my joy, my retreat from everything else. When I first planted it, I knew I'd be pushing the boundaries of what the homeowners association liked. They loved their uniformity, their manicured lawns, their soulless beige repetition. But I also knew the rules, and I followed them to the letter. The bylaws allowed decorative plants, as long as they weren't unsightly or encroaching on common property. And mine wasn't either. It was neat, organized, and honestly more attractive than half the weedy patches some people called lawns. At first, it was just a few lavender bushes, then a row of native wildflowers. I added stepping stones, a little solar light path, and, eventually, some raised beds with herbs and vegetables. It grew slowly, over the course of 2 years, until it was something that neighbors actually stopped by to compliment. Bees buzzed, butterflies danced over the blooms and the smell of rosemary, and mint drifted on summer evenings. Kids from down the street liked walking past it on their way home from school, pointing out the bright marigolds and tall sunflowers. But where most people saw charm, at least one person saw nothing but a problem. Her name was Brenda, though everyone called her the HOA Karen. She was the president of our HOA board, and she wore that title like a badge of honor. Brenda was the type who measured grass with a ruler, who left anonymous notes if someone's trash can lingered on the curb 10 minutes past collection time. She loved catching people breaking the rules, and she especially loved reminding them who was in charge. For the first year or so, Brenda left me alone. I think she assumed the garden would fizzle out on its own, that I'd get tired of weeding or watering and let it shrivel up like the empty patches of lawn she seemed to prefer. But when she realized the garden was thriving, her attitude shifted. She began making comments at HOA meetings about non-standard landscaping and unauthorized plantings. She never said my name, but everyone knew exactly who she meant. I ignored it, because I had nothing to hide. My garden was well within the rules, and I kept records of everything I'd planted. The bylaws allowed edible plants, as long as they were maintained neatly. The bylaws allowed decorative lighting, as long as it wasn't intrusive. The bylaws allowed raised beds, as long as they didn't exceed a certain height, and mine didn't. Still, Brenda kept watching. Sometimes I'd catch her slowly driving past my house, her head craning toward the yard. Sometimes she'd stand on the sidewalk, hands on hips, glaring like I'd vandalized the neighborhood instead of adding to its beauty. It reached a boiling point one summer afternoon when I left for a week-long trip to visit family. Before leaving, I'd mulched the beds carefully, watered thoroughly, and set up an automatic irrigation system. Everything was healthy and thriving when I locked the door behind me. But when I returned, the garden was gone. At first, I thought I had the wrong house. That's how shocking it was. Where once there had been bursts of color, now there was only dirt. The stepping stones had been ripped up, the raised beds were gone, even the solar lights had disappeared. Lavender, sunflowers, basil, mint, all of it reduced to stumps or simply torn out by the roots. I remember standing there with my suitcase still in hand, staring at the destruction. It wasn't just vandalism. It was systematic removal. Someone had deliberately, carefully, and maliciously wiped my garden off the face of the earth. Neighbors came out one by one, watching me realize what had happened. A few looked guilty, like they knew something. One finally approached and told me the truth. While I was gone, Brenda had ordered a landscaping crew to restore conformity to my yard. She'd told them the garden was a violation of HOA policy and instructed them to remove everything. My heart sank, and then rage set in. Brenda had no authority to do that without due process. She hadn't issued a violation notice, hadn't requested compliance, hadn't even bothered with a warning. She had simply decided she didn't like it, declared herself judge and jury, and annihilated something I'd built over years. When I confronted her, she didn't apologize. She didn't even look guilty. She just smugly said that she had cleaned up the mess while I was away. She claimed my garden was attracting pests, that it was not in keeping with neighborhood standards. She even had the audacity to tell me I should be thanking her, but I didn't thank her. I documented everything. I took photos of the bare ground, of the broken irrigation system, of the scraps of plants left behind. I spoke with the landscaping crew who admitted she had hired them directly and paid out of the HOA funds. I spoke with neighbors who had witnessed the removal. Piece by piece, I built a case. At first, I considered suing her directly for property damage. But the more I researched, the more I realized there was another angle. You see, my garden hadn't just been decorative. I'd specifically planted native pollinator species, plants protected under a state environmental regulation. Removing them without a permit wasn't just an HOA matter, it was a violation of state law. I filed a complaint. With the state's Department of Environmental Protection, I submitted all the documentation, the photos, the witness statements, even receipts showing when and where I'd purchased the native plants. I knew the process would take time, but I was patient. Brenda thought she'd won, but what she didn't know was that she had set herself up for something far worse than a simple neighborhood spat. Weeks went by, and I heard nothing. Brenda carried herself with that same smug authority, bragging at HOA meetings about how she'd handled a problem property. I bit my tongue, letting her dig herself deeper, letting her get comfortable in her victory. And then one morning, everything changed. Brenda received a letter in the mail. Not a petty HOA complaint, not a neighbor's note, a formal notice from the state. A fine, hefty, unavoidable, and very, very real. The day she opened it was the day the smugness drained from her face, and that was only the beginning. The envelope changed everything. Up until that moment, Brenda had lived in her own little kingdom of control. She'd ruled the HOA like a monarch, issuing edicts and threats, bending rules whenever it suited her. Most people went along with it, either because they didn't want trouble or because they assumed she actually knew what she was talking about. But the state didn't care about Brenda's authority. The state only cared about laws. And the law was very clear. The letter spelled it out in black and white. By authorizing the removal of native pollinator species from a residential property without a permit, Brenda had triggered a violation of state environmental protection statutes, and violations like that carried fines. Not the kind of slap on the wrist. HOA fines she loved to hand out, but real government penalties. Thousands of dollars. Brenda's reaction was immediate. First came denial. She told anyone who would listen that it was all a mistake, that the state must have gotten bad information. She marched from house to house, clutching the letter, waving it in people's faces like she could shame them into agreeing with her. "Fake news," she scoffed, as though state officials had nothing better to do than conspire against her garden vendetta. But when denial didn't stick, anger bubbled up. She accused me of setting her up, of weaponizing bureaucracy to punish her. She claimed my garden had been illegal from the start, that she had acted in the best interest of the neighborhood, that the fine should fall on me instead. It was the classic Karen defense: shift the blame, paint herself as the victim, and hope everyone else swallowed it. Only this time, they didn't. Neighbors began murmuring, quietly at first, then louder. People who had always rolled their eyes at Brenda but kept silent suddenly found courage. The moment money was involved, real money, not just HOA dues, was the moment the tide shifted, because the fine hadn't been issued to her personally. It had been issued to the Homeowners Association, and that meant everyone's dues were on the hook. The next HOA meeting was chaos. Brenda strutted in with her usual air of superiority, but the room was buzzing. Normally, only a handful of residents showed up, the same few who cared enough to sit through her lectures about lawn height and mailbox paint colors. This time, the room was packed. People stood in the back, arms crossed, eyes locked on Brenda. With thinly disguised fury, the agenda was simple: the fine. Brenda tried to spin it. She insisted that the garden had been a liability, that she'd saved the neighborhood from property value decline, that the fine was an unfortunate but temporary setback. She promised to appeal it, as if her self-declared authority extended to state regulators. But her words landed flat. One man stood and asked the question on everyone's mind: why had Brenda bypassed procedure? Why hadn't she issued a violation notice, held a compliance hearing, or sought approval from the board before spending HOA funds on a private landscaping crew? Another neighbor pointed out that the bylaws required 3 signatures to authorize any expense over $500, yet Brenda had signed off on the invoice herself. Her excuses crumbled under scrutiny. The more she tried to defend herself, the deeper the hole got. For once, the glares weren't aimed at me. They were aimed at her. As I sat there, silent, watching it all unfold, I realized Brenda had underestimated something fundamental. She thought the HOA existed to protect conformity. In reality, it existed to protect people's money. And when she jeopardized that, when she risked thousands in fines on a personal vendetta, she broke the unspoken pact that kept her in power. After the meeting, whispers spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had been neutral before now openly criticized her. People talked about recalling her as HOA president, about auditing the books, about hiring outside legal counsel to see what else she might have mishandled. Brenda, of course, doubled down. She launched a smear campaign against me, slipping letters into mailboxes accusing me of being a troublemaker who brought government interference into the neighborhood. She claimed I had exaggerated the destruction of my garden, that I had baited her into making a mistake. It was laughable, but the desperation was obvious. Still, she wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. The fine was only the beginning. The state required remediation. That meant the HOA would have to restore the native plants that had been destroyed under supervision using approved species from certified nurseries. And that wasn't cheap. On top of the fine itself, the cost of replanting was going to hit the budget hard. The more Brenda fought, the more she revealed her ignorance. She hadn't even known the plants were protected. She hadn't known the HOA could be held liable. She hadn't known that hiring a crew to rip everything out without following due process would expose the board to financial and legal risk. She had acted impulsively, and now the whole community was paying for it. And yet, she still tried to cling to power. I'll never forget the day I saw her storming around the neighborhood with a clipboard, collecting signatures for a petition. She wanted to amend the bylaws retroactively to prohibit gardens like mine outright. She thought that if she could rewrite the rules, she could justify what she had done. But people weren't signing. Some refused outright, others closed their doors in her face, and a few even laughed. Her arrogance had blinded her to the fact that she was no longer feared. She was pitied. The real breaking point came when the HOA treasurer resigned. He stood up at the next meeting, handed in his papers, and said he wouldn't be responsible for cleaning up Brenda's mess. He announced that he'd contacted an attorney to review the situation, and that attorney had advised the board to distance itself from her actions immediately. The room erupted in murmurs, and for the first time, Brenda looked rattled. She wasn't untouchable anymore. For me, the satisfaction was bittersweet. My garden was still gone, reduced to nothing but dirt and memories. The fine wouldn't bring back the years of care and growth I'd lost. But watching Brenda squirm, watching her empire crack beneath her feet, that was something. And I knew it wasn't over yet, because the state's involvement was only one part of the storm. The other part was the neighborhood itself and the growing movement to strip Brenda of her crown. As the meeting ended and neighbors filed out, someone muttered words that stuck with me. "She's not the HOA Karen anymore. She's just Brenda. And Brenda's about to find out what happens when you mess with the wrong garden." The battle lines had been drawn. Brenda should have stepped down. Most people in her position would have. After all, the writing was on the wall. The neighbors were furious. The HOA was financially strained, and the state had already handed down a hefty fine. But Brenda wasn't like most people. She couldn't fathom the idea of losing control. To her, being HOA president wasn't just a title, it was her identity. And when that identity was threatened, she lashed out with everything she had. The first sign of her desperation came quietly. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes, printed on neon paper, covered in dramatic fonts and underlined warnings. The headline screamed in bold, "Protect our neighborhood from government overreach." The flyers painted Brenda as a misunderstood leader, a brave defender of property values who had been unfairly targeted by meddling bureaucrats and vindictive residents. She didn't name me outright, but it was obvious who she was, pointing the finger at. According to her version of events, I had orchestrated everything. I had weaponized obscure environmental laws, tricked the state into issuing a fine, and jeopardized the community for my own selfish agenda. She urged neighbors to stand with her and sign a petition to overturn the requirement to restore the garden. The irony was staggering. She was asking people to side with her against the very law she had broken, the same law that was now binding the HOA to fix her mistake. But Brenda wasn't finished. She began stalking the neighborhood with her infamous clipboard again, knocking on doors, demanding signatures. She claimed she had a plan to fight back against the state. She promised that if re-elected, she would use HOA funds to hire lawyers and battle the regulators. Most people turned her away. A few laughed. Some simply closed their doors. But Brenda did manage to collect a handful of signatures. The same handful of die-hard loyalists who had always admired her bossy efficiency. They were the ones who believed that strict rules and heavy-handed enforcement were the only things keeping the neighborhood from descending into chaos. It wasn't nearly enough. Meanwhile, the state's remediation order was moving forward. Inspectors came to survey the damage, documenting the bare patches where my pollinator plants had once grown. They noted the absence of milkweed, coneflowers, and bee balm, species specifically listed in the state's conservation program. They didn't care about Brenda's excuses or petitions. They simply laid out the next steps. The HOA was required to replant, using certified nurseries under supervision. And the cost? Substantial. Thousands of dollars. Money the HOA didn't have, thanks to Brenda's reckless spending. The board scrambled, trying to figure out how to cover it. They discussed raising dues, dipping into reserves, even delaying planned maintenance on common areas. But every option came with backlash, and every backlash landed squarely on Brenda's shoulders. Still, she refused to accept responsibility. She began spreading rumors that the treasurer had mishandled funds, that the secretary was incompetent, that the board was conspiring against her. At one point, she even claimed the state inspector was a personal friend of mine, part of some grand conspiracy to ruin her. It would have been laughable if it weren't so exhausting. Neighbors grew weary of her antics. People who had once stayed silent now spoke openly about recalling her. The idea gained momentum, fueled by frustration over rising dues and wasted money. Brenda responded with fury, calling emergency meetings, threatening legal action against anyone who tried to oust her, and insisting she was the only one capable of protecting the neighborhood. But the cracks in her empire were widening. One evening, I noticed a group of neighbors gathered on a lawn across the street whispering in low voices. They weren't talking about gardens anymore. They were talking about Brenda's misuse of funds, about the landscaping crew she had hired without approval, about the possibility of filing a lawsuit against her personally. Some had even started digging through old HOA records, looking for other instances of financial misconduct. It was only a matter of time before they found something. And then they did. Neighbor uncovered invoices showing that Brenda had authorized repeated maintenance expenses over the past year, all just under the $500 threshold that required board approval. Individually, they seemed small. Collectively, they added up to thousands. She had been quietly funneling HOA money into projects without oversight, hiding behind technicalities. When this discovery came to light, the anger reached a boiling point. The community wasn't just dealing with a destroyed garden anymore, they were dealing with potential fraud. Brenda's response was classic denial. She claimed the invoices were routine, that she was simply streamlining the process, that she had acted in the best interest of the community. But her words rang hollow. The evidence spoke louder. The board called for a special meeting to address the allegations. Flyers went out announcing the agenda. Discussion of HOA presidents, conduct and financial accountability. The turnout was massive. Neighbors crammed into the community center, their voices sharp, their patience gone. Brenda stood at the front, clutching her notes, her face tight with forced composure. She tried to rally, tried to spin the story one last time. She painted. Herself as a martyr, claimed she was being persecuted for enforcing standards and accused her critics of plotting a coup. But the crowd wasn't buying it. One by one, neighbors stood to speak. They talked about rising dues, about the fine, about the destroyed garden. They demanded answers about the invoices, about the unauthorized spending, about the abuse of authority. The room buzzed with anger. A tidal wave Brenda couldn't hold back. For the first time, she looked small. Not the commanding HOA queen, but a cornered figure, clinging desperately to power that was slipping through her fingers. The meeting ended without a vote, but the writing was clear on the wall. Brenda's reign was collapsing. As people filed, "Out," I overheard one neighbor mutter what everyone else was thinking. "It's not about the garden anymore. It's about trust." And Brenda broke it. The next step would be decisive. The community wasn't just whispering about a recall anymore. They were preparing for it, and Brenda, true to form, wasn't going to go quietly. The neighborhood had reached its breaking point. For months, Brenda had ruled the HOA with an iron fist, hiding behind rules, twisting bylaws, and spending money as if it were her personal account. But the fine, the invoices, and the state's order to restore the garden had pulled back the curtain. Everyone saw her for what she was, not a protector of the neighborhood, but a liability. The whispers of discontent had grown into open revolt. Flyers circulated, this time not from Brenda, but from the residents themselves. They were simple sheets of paper taped to mailboxes and pinned to bulletin boards. Special meeting, recall vote for HOA president. The date was set, the petition signed by more than the required number of homeowners. The battle was no longer theoretical, it was official. Brenda, of course, didn't take it lying down. The week leading up to the vote was chaos. She launched what could only be described as a smear campaign. Anonymous letters appeared in people's mail slots, filled with accusations and rumors. One accused the treasurer of embezzlement. Another claimed the secretary was colluding with developers to destroy the character of the neighborhood. Still another insinuated that I had financial ties to the nursery suppliers who stood to profit from the state's restoration order. The letters were sloppy, typed in a default font. Unsigned but reeking of her voice, nobody was fooled. Instead of turning people against her opponents, the letters just fueled more anger. If anything, they proved just how desperate she had become. But Brenda didn't stop there. She began holding her own meetings at her house, inviting her small circle of loyalists. They sat on her patio, nodding along as she railed against the witch hunt and plotted strategies to swing the recall in her favor. She promised them lower dues, stricter enforcement, and cleaner streets if they voted to keep her in power. To them, it sounded like order. To everyone else, it sounded like dictatorship. And then came the intimidation tactics. Several neighbors reported being followed by Brenda on her evening walks, her phone in hand, snapping pictures of their yards. She left sticky notes on doors with vague warnings like, "Your trash cans are out of compliance. Expect a violation soon." She weaponized the same tactics she had always used, hoping fear would keep people in line. But this time, people weren't afraid. They were angry. By the time the night of the recall meeting arrived, the tension was palpable. The community center was packed, every chair filled, neighbors lined up along the walls. The air buzzed with chatter, frustration, and anticipation. At the front of the room sat Brenda, clutching a binder stuffed with papers, her jaw tight, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. The board members flanked her, visibly uncomfortable, caught between the need for procedure and the tidal wave of fury aimed at the woman who had once commanded their obedience. The meeting began with formalities, but everyone knew why they were there. The recall vote was the centerpiece, and Brenda was determined to have her say before ballots were cast. She launched into a tirade, waving her binder like a shield. She insisted the invoices were legitimate, that her spending had been necessary to maintain neighborhood standards. She claimed the fine was unjust, the state regulators overstepping their bounds, and that anyone supporting the recall was siding with outsiders against their own community. Her voice grew louder, sharper, more desperate. She pointed fingers, calling out neighbors by name, accusing them of personal vendettas. She even tried to turn the destruction of my garden into proof of her strength, arguing that she had taken action when others were too weak to enforce the rules. But her words didn't land the way she wanted. Instead of rallying support, they revealed her instability. Every accusation, every outburst, only hardened the resolve of those listening. When the floor was opened for residents to speak, the room erupted. One after another, neighbors stood and voiced their frustration. They spoke of the fines, the wasted money, the harassment, the intimidation. They spoke of trust broken, of rules bent to serve one person's ego, of the embarrassment of having state regulators stepping in because their HOA president couldn't follow the law. And then, a voice from the back delivered the final blow. It was the former treasurer, the one who had resigned in protest weeks earlier. He held up a stack of papers, bank statements, invoices, receipts, and read aloud the totals. Brenda had spent over $7,000 in unauthorized expenses over the past year alone. Money that should have gone to reserves, to maintenance, to the community itself, had been funneled into her pet projects without approval. The room went silent as the number sank in. For a moment, Brenda tried to protest, to claim it was all taken, out of context, but even her loyalists looked shaken. The evidence was undeniable. The board chair announced that the recall vote would proceed immediately. Ballots were passed out, neighbors scribbled their choices, and within minutes, the results were counted. It wasn't even close. By an overwhelming majority, Brenda was removed from her position as HOA president. The room erupted, not in celebration exactly, but in a collective sigh of relief. The reign of the HOA Karen was over. But the story didn't end there, because Brenda wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. As she gathered her things, her face red and her hands trembling, she spat words of defiance. She claimed the vote was illegitimate, that the process was flawed, that she would challenge it in court. She stormed out of the community center, binder clutched to her chest like a lifeline, muttering threats of lawsuits and appeals. Neighbors watched her leave, some shaking their heads, others exchanging wary glances. The recall had been decisive, but everyone knew Brenda wasn't done. She would fight, claw, and scheme to the bitter end. And as I walked home that night, I couldn't help but feel a mix of satisfaction and dread. Satisfaction that justice had finally caught up with her. Dread that her desperation might drive her to one last act of chaos. The neighborhood was free but not safe, not yet. Brenda had lost her crown, but queens rarely go quietly. The recall should have been the end. Most people, when stripped of their power in front of their entire community, would have walked away, licked their wounds, and faded into the background. But Brenda wasn't like most people. For her, being HOA president wasn't just a role. It was her identity, her throne, her proof of superiority. Losing it meant losing herself. And she wasn't about to let go quietly. In the weeks after the recall, the neighborhood experienced a strange calm. The new interim board got to work repairing the damage Brenda had left behind. They reviewed the books, tightened spending policies, and began coordinating with the state to meet the remediation order. For the first time in months, there was a sense of progress, of responsibility. But just as things seemed to settle, Brenda struck again. Letters began arriving in mailboxes, this time not the sloppy, unsigned kind. These were printed on letterhead, written in stiff legalese, and stamped with the name of a local attorney. They claimed the recall had been procedurally invalid and threatened a lawsuit against the HOA for wrongful removal. According to the letter, Brenda demanded reinstatement, back pay for her volunteer service, and damages for defamation of character. It was absurd. But absurdity has a way of sowing fear. Some neighbors worried about the cost of legal battles. Others wondered if Brenda could actually win. The interim board, though newly formed, suddenly found themselves staring down the barrel of potential litigation before they had even warmed their seats. The attorney's letter, however, had one glaring problem. It was riddled with factual errors. The bylaws were cited incorrectly, dates were wrong, and claims were exaggerated beyond belief. A quick review by the HOA's own counsel revealed the truth. Brenda hadn't hired a real lawyer. She had drafted the letters herself, slapped a legal header on them, and hoped no one would notice. When this was exposed at the next community meeting, laughter rippled through the room. The fear melted into anger, then into mockery. Brenda's attempt to intimidate had backfired. Instead of rallying support, she had humiliated herself further. But the real blow was still to come. The state's investigation hadn't stopped with the fine. Inspectors had flagged the unauthorized landscaping work, and that triggered a deeper look into the HOA's financial practices. When the auditors reviewed the invoices Brenda had signed, patterns emerged, payments to companies with vague names, duplicate charges for the same services, expenses that had no supporting documentation. It didn't take long for suspicions of mismanagement to become suspicions of fraud. The final nail came when one of the landscaping companies admitted, under questioning, that Brenda had received consulting fees for using their services. Kickbacks. She had been profiting off the very projects she had forced the HOA to fund. When word of this broke, the community was stunned. What had started as a battle over a garden had spiraled into a scandal involving state regulators, financial misconduct, and potential criminal charges. Brenda's house, once the hub of HOA authority, became a fortress. Curtains drawn, car gone for days at a time, no one answering the door. Rumors spread that she had hired yet another lawyer, this time a real one, to defend herself against the possibility of charges. Some said she might sell the house and disappear. Others whispered that the state could seize assets if the kickbacks were proven. Through it all, the neighborhood carried on. The board hired a certified nursery to begin restoring the garden space, not just on my property, but in common areas as well. What Brenda had destroyed out of spite became the foundation for something bigger, a pollinator-friendly initiative across the neighborhood. Milkweed, coneflowers, bee balm, lavender, plants that once stood only in my yard now appeared along pathways near the community entrance, even by the playground. Neighbors who had once ignored each other began working side by side, digging, planting, mulching. Children painted rocks to line the beds. Volunteers installed new solar lights. The neighborhood was no longer defined by Brenda's rules. It was defined by resilience. And my garden, though scarred, returned. Slowly at first, green shoots poking through the soil, blossoms unfurling under the sun, but stronger than before. Every time I watered, every time I pulled a weed, I felt a sense of justice, not just for myself, but for everyone Brenda had bullied. The day the first butterflies returned, fluttering over the restored milkweed, was the day I knew the battle was truly over. As for Brenda, her fate became something of a legend. Officially, she was forced to resign from the HOA board permanently, barred from holding office again. The HOA filed a civil claim to recover the money she had mishandled, and the state levied additional penalties for the kickbacks. The once feared HOA Karen, who had ruled with arrogance and intimidation, was left with nothing but fines, debt, and a reputation in tatters. Some say she moved away in the dead of night, selling her house at a loss. Others claim she still lives there, hiding behind closed curtains, stewing in resentment while the neighborhood thrives without her. Either way, her reign was over, her name forever tarnished. The irony is that all of it, every fine, every lawsuit, every ounce of humiliation, started with a garden, a patch of earth she couldn't leave alone. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if she truly believed she was right, or if it was always about control. Maybe she convinced herself she was protecting the neighborhood. Maybe she just wanted to remind everyone she was in charge. Either way, her downfall was her own doing. She thought she was untouchable, but laws are laws, and communities have limits. And when those limits are pushed too far, even the loudest Karen falls silent. The garden grows again, the neighborhood breathes easier, and the lesson lingers. No one, not even the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, is above accountability. The butterflies don't care who tried to stop them. They just return, year after year, proof that resilience always wins.